Welcome back, travelers, to the Planeswalker's Tome, your portal to the realms of Magic the Gathering. Whether you're joining us on YouTube or through a podcast, we're thrilled to have you along for the journey. Now, let us resume our exploration of The Eternal Ice by Jeff Grubb. Chapter 12. Mage Counsels. Comparisons are normally made between warriors and wizards, between sellswords and spellcasters. The obvious differences are: warriors work in the realm of flesh reality, while mages exist in the ethereal one of magical forces. Good warriors have strong limbs. Good wizards have flexible minds. Yet the fact remains that there are many more warriors than wizards, and large armies than magical schools. Why is this? In part, it goes to the first statement, that warriors deal with the real as opposed to the magical. The average peasant does not need to have reality explained or justified. The reason why the world is as it is often falls on deaf ears. Everyone knows that the world is as it is. Then why try explaining it? Magic, on the other hand, requires a sense of faith. In an unseen world, even the forces of that world have an effect in the reality. Magery is more of an art than a science, and as such requires a level of comprehension. That is, a step that few seem to be able to take. But I believe there's another reason. There are many warriors in existence because humans and other races have come up with a codified system for soldiers. The various armies have ranks and positions, and awards to let every member of that organization know exactly where they were falling in the pecking order. Guardsmen to corporal to sergeant to captain. Mages, on the other hand, only have developed the concept at the point of fighting duels over the levels of power, and while many of duels are non-fatal, they leave long-lasting scars. Imagine how sparse our armies would be if the only method of advancement was conflict with your superiors. That is how many magical organizations function, and as a result, they are in a state of regular flux. Wizards could learn a few things from the warriors and generals if the mages only took time to ask, and had the wherewithal to listen. Argivian scholar. For Jodah, the early half of the evening was taken up with the cheerful effort of planned tedium that is known as the Royal Banquet. He had lived through it before many times, and found the components identical regardless of the century. Posturing by the courtiers, ignorance from the leaders, and a visible display of jousting from the upper strata of the social orders. The fact that he knew it so clearly was almost enough to make him want to have his mind wiped clean again, if only from sheer boredom. Jodah smiled at the thought. He would normally expect someone like Yaya Ballard to think that, and not him. The reception hall was the floor directly beneath the throne room, and was a 2-story endeavor. Again, with a balcony on the second floor, reserved for the less favored. Jodah was at the royal table, seated between His Majesty and the royal mage. The placement was intended as an honor, but all it did was make Jodah conscious that he was sitting too close to the center of a growing storm. After his first meeting with King Darian early in the day, Jodah would have agreed that His Majesty is an inefficient wastrel, no worse than most of the royalty he had encountered in Tezier over the century, and definitely no better. Now, watching the king of the dating party, Jodah revived his estimation of the lad upwards slightly. There was more beneath that pumpkin-colored mop of hair than first appeared. Jodah was surprised the king got to eat at all. Throughout the meal he was under relentless assault from his court. This merchant, that mage, this cleric, that soldier, all approaching as individuals for some favor, some consideration, or some advice. His Majesty listened hard, and then usually demurred, promising to consider the case at a later time. Jodah knew what was happening from his own experiences as leader of the School of the Unseen. There's no sense of delegation to the government here, and no one who would take orders from anybody less than the absolute ruler. In return, in order to rule at all, the king had to avoid irritating any one group. The end result was the weakness that Yaya mentioned that the people felt. It was not insolence, for the king was dancing as fast as he could. There were just too many partners to deal with. In Jodah's case, after the first 50 years on Latnam, he established himself in an emeritus position as archmage, established a powerful enough bureaucracy to make the sages happy. Let it be known that those who bothered him on minor matters would be fried on the spot. That seemed to work. Jodah thought about Gerda's treachery and his most recent adventures. Perhaps the system did not work as well as he had hoped. Despite this, Jodah suggested the idea of a council to Kastata, who shook her head in response. Bane tried. Too unwieldy, she said. The first thing that everybody did when a council was formed was try to dominate it, and claim that their own desires were the council's wills. As soon as someone did that, a group would splinter off, and another group splinter from that. The result is what we see today. Anarchy, suggested Jodah, as the 12th merchant staggered away from the table, having given the young king his sagely advice. Factionalism, said Gastata. There are so many orders, sects, schisms, school of thoughts, and Kejildor, that it takes a great threat to make people pull together, like the Ice, or the Barbarians. Or Limdul, suggested Jodah, and he watched the royal mage's face as he said it. There are those who believe that even the necromancer can be dealt with, she said. I suppose it depends on what one means by dealt with, doesn't it? Said Jodah sharply, and Gasthatha suddenly found herself more interested in their meal. Jodah had seen wicked kings and foolish kings, and rarely wise kings. This Darien was no dullard, but he was obviously in over his head. While he tried to keep everything on an even keel, people thought him weak for his efforts. Jodah scanned the room. Where are the various fighting orders? Gasthatha shook back her mane of dark hair and pointed out the assembled group. The royal guards at the doors. The elites are on the upper balcony. And what of the leaders? Asked Jodah. Garrison. Varchild. I am surprised Avram Garrison would leave me alone within earshot of his majesty. He was most vociferous this afternoon, when I tried to warn him of Limdul's threat. Garrison does not join us, said Gasthatha. She leaned forward slightly and added in a conspiratorial whisper that carried at least 20 feet. He is upset that Darien will not make him general of all the armies, like old Jarkold was. He thinks the late queen should have done the same, and he was actively campaigning for the position when she died. The new king followed his mother's tendency, and has promised to consider the matter. That infuriates Avram. Consideration is a nice word for please go away and don't bother me around here. The king is wiser than he looks, thought Jodah. But he said, and Captain Varchild? Gasthatha managed a shrug in her heavy ceremonial robes. Many of the leaders of the orders would rather spend time with their soldiers. There's much to do, and there have been problems of late. Gasthatha smiled a radiant grin, clearly pleased that some other branch of the social order was suffering from factionalism and disruption. To mask her delight, however, she did pick out a few Sky Knights who joined the feast, along with a minor lieutenant or two from some of the orders. None were closer than 50 feet to the king, and only one or two appeared for favors. Jodah let the conversation slide away into more meaningless things. The cut of beef and the marinade, the coldness of the winters and the crops coming from the south. The subject of the Kejadorian magicians' own factions came up, and Gastha waved aside any talk that the mechanists had problems with the elementalist factions, or that the followers of the charismatic Zur, who had fled into the wilderness after breaking with the established orders, were anything more than nettlesome busybodies. Imagine, she said, Zur led all these people into the wilderness on the promises that magic could make them live forever. Imagine their surprise when they found out he was wrong. Yes, said Jodah dryly. Imagine. Gastha caught herself immediately and asked, Given your own reputed longevity, she managed smoothly, I am surprised the two of you never corresponded. We talked, said Jodah, managing an indifferent shrug of his own. I found him less than cogent on his arguments. Gastha nodded, and when nothing more was forthcoming, steered the conversation to news from the west. For his part, Jodah held up his end of the talk, answering Gastha's questions directly without revealing any secrets of the school. All the while, he watched the continuous stream of supplicants begging for the king's ear, with nothing standing in the way of their efforts. Finally, the last of the courses was cleared, and the musicians, hidden in some upper loft, launched into stilted renditions of a love ballad from 300 years previous. Jodah grimaced at both the timing and the key. He turned to Gastha and said, Perhaps I should make an early night of it. Let me accompany you, she said, brightly motioning to a pair of guards to peel away from the wall. Perhaps you would want to check on your associate before you retired. Jodah did not blink. I was intending to speak with the king on this matter, but I can see he is quite busy. Besides, 1 or 2 nights locked up might teach my associate some matters in dealing with more powerful mages. Gastha beamed an electric smile, and Jodah returned it volt for volt. I'm afraid his majesty is just starting, explained Gastha. From here he'll retire to the throne room, where more supplicants will undoubtedly pester him until the wee hours. Jodah shook his head, and Gastha added, If you're not too tired, I'd like you to meet one of our artificers, a mechanist who's been working here in the court. Jodah nodded and motioned for Gastha to lead on. They left the banquet accompanied by 2 armed guards serving as Jodah's escort and watchers. Alongside him in her heavy ceremonial robes, the royal mage looked like a great ship, navigating the stairs and courtyards leading to the Royal Academy. Within the academy there were more stairs, more hallways, and Jodah mentally calculated where he was within the complex, and let the silence between him and the royal mage grow. To Jodah, it seemed that the woman was internally researching some speech. He gave her the time. Finally, halfway down the staircase, royal mage Gastha, Abba's daughter, turned to him and said, About your mirror. Mirror? Puzzled Jodah, looking as blank as he could muster. About the item in my quarters that your compatriot removed, she said. To Jodah, she seemed about ready to swallow her tongue. I want you to know I regret having it in my keeping, as I do regret losing it, said the archmage calmly. But what's done is done, and the advantage of regrets is to use them to avoid repetitions. I will have your assistant freed, she said. She's about to reveal a secret, thought Jodah, and she's going to ask a favor in return. In the morning, he said softly. Now let's meet your mechanists. The mechanist greeted him at the door. He was a diminutive, immaculate man. His premature grayish hair swept back at the temples to reveal a prominent bony brow. His eyes were bright and continually darting about everything. He was dressed in heavy, red-hued robes that clung tightly around him. Arkham, he bowed deeply at introductions. Arkham Dagson, of the Soldevi Mechanists. Arkham brought a lot of devices from Soldev that his order has been working on, Gusta explained. Some seem to have potentials, some less so. Jodah nodded absent-mindedly. The various artificers he had met over the years all fell into two categories, diggers and tinkers. He wondered which category this Arkham fell into. It's one of the large items I want you to look at, said Gusta. Even as she spoke, the Soldevi Mechanist motioned for them to enter. The machine was 2 stories high, too large for any normal room, and indeed the floor above had been sawn away to accompany it. It was a travesty of parts and gimcracks, welded together into a spinning collection of cogs. Arkham was already throwing switches and levers. Somewhere deep in the machine came the woofing rush of something igniting, and the whine of a hidden turbine. It will take a moment, said Arkham. I want to run the summary one more time. And this is, said Jodah, not caring if Gusta or Arkham answered. A weather predicting machine, said the Soldevi. Short and long range. I originally built in Soldev. This is the twin here. Now I find something else. He paused, waving the expected finger at the machine. And that something was? Questioned Jodah, feeling exhausted already by the small man. Let it warm up, said Arkham. Just a moment now. Gusta calls you the Archmage Eternal. That is a title I've worn, said Jodah, not expecting the conversation's abrupt turn. Were you a student with Urza and Mishra? He asked. Jodah opened his mouth to reply, shut it again, then smiled. No, I'm not that old. Why, you are the Archmage Eternal, shrugged Arkham Dagson, watching his machine. I thought you might have met them, studied with one or the other. Perhaps when they were just apprentices, building their first devices. The stories I learned as a boy, explained Jodah, said that they were apprenticed to an archaeologist, digging up old items from the past. Arkham shot a look at Jodah. Really? He said, his voice trailing upwards. Jodah nodded. It was excavating old devices of their Thran that showed them how to make their own. Arkham raised his eyebrows and moved his jaw back and forth as if tasting the idea. I had never considered that. Of course, it makes sense. You do not reinvent the wheel. Of course, there is so little of that time left. Still, an archaeologist. Interesting. Jodah sighed impatiently. This Arkham was a tinker and was for the first time considering digging. The Archmage tried to hurry the demonstration. Your device. Arkham nodded. Yes. Walk round here to the side. At the side of the construct were a series of clay drums. Along each drum, a stylus carved a path in the soft clay. I can ink the drums and print the data and the paper for easy transport. The mechanist pointed to the different drums. Each of these maps a different prediction. Temperature, rainfall, cloud cover. I've been using historical records to predict future behavior. It's been right 9 times out of 10. Jodah bent down over one of the drums. If I read this correctly, he said, we have snow coming. That's not unexpected. It's going to get very cold. Ah, but look at the drums for a month from now, said the mechanist. Mostly clear and colder, said Jodah. That's a little late for the temperature drop. And this, he directed to the 6-month drum. Jodah frowned as read the results. I must be reading this wrong, said the Archmage. Then I'm really bad at it as well, replied Arkham. This says it's going to become colder still, by midsummer, said Jodah. He looked at mechanists. There must be something wrong with your calculations. Arkham looked hurt. I double-checked everything. I even assumed that there's an error in my original machine and built a new one here in Grubb. But nothing. The winter will deepen as we go along. Jodah looked at the device with its comical collection of batters and gears. He turned to Gusta. Do you believe it? It has been right to date, said the Royal Mage. Predictions made 6 months ago have come true. Yes, I believe it. Jodah stroked his chin. Then something else is involved. Perhaps there is some inherent error in your data that you fed in, or some assumption in your calculations, or even some physical flaw in your machine. As if in response, a warm breeze wafted over the 3 of them. The predictive engine immediately started chiming warning noises and hissing menacingly, and the starlight began waving erratically, as if to prove Arkham wrong in its reliability. The mechanist yelped and started pulling levers, trying to shut down his prediction machine. Gusta looked at Jodah, embarrassed and amused. Perhaps I have put too much worry into such a device, but I wanted you to see. It is a very interesting device, said Jodah. Perhaps its prediction is localized. Maybe if we were to offer you some data from our own vaults at the Unseen University, you could check your results against those for this region. Gusta smiled and nodded. Jodah had apparently guessed the favor she was going to ask. The machinist's eyes lit up. If you could, obviously something is amiss here, and more data would be ideal. The Royal Mage and the Archmage left Arkham Dagson at the foot of the machine, where he was talking about modifications needed to accept other historical numbers. Gusta offered a smile. He is very committed, she said. Or he should be committed, said Jodah. Still, I worry about these results. Are they common knowledge? Gusta shook her head. With everything else, why worry the crowd about this? They walked to the castle complex, to Gusta's tower. Jodah had been installed in an apartment held for individuals of his power. the one Yaya had mentioned on the 3rd floor of the peak. They climbed the stairs within the tower slowly, and spoke of spells and runes and teaching as they did. At last, they reached the level of Jodah's apartment. The guards took up their station on either side of the door. "I hope you have a good rest, and that we can talk more tomorrow," Gusta said. "Actually, I find the talk refreshing," said Jodah, "and I have a little magical business I must perform with your aid. Do you have a magical circle? Something that I might use to communicate with my school? Of course, I would want you present." Gusta hesitated for a moment, then agreed. Obviously, Yaya Ballard would have told him about the reception chamber. Of course it would be rude to ignore the request. She left the 2 guards at the landing and ushered Jodah up the remaining flights to her private quarters. As soon as they were through the door, Jodah heard cursing from the reception chamber. A frown dimpled Gusta's face, and she pressed immediately into the incense-laden room. Jodah followed her more leisurely. Gusta had left the censer burning through the evening. In the gathered smoke of the reception hall was the ghostly form of Gerda Egg's daughter, Magus of the Unseen. Her white hair was in disarray, and she was spitting epithets. "It's about time you got back," Gerda nearly shouted, the smoke writhing around her form. "I've been trying to reach you all damn night. I've got a crisis here, and—" "Calm, cousin," said Gusta smoothly. "We have company." "I don't care an rump about your comp," snarled Gerda. She stopped short, noticing Jodah as he stepped closer to the ritual circle. "Lord Jodah!" The Magus of the Unseen dropped to one knee effortlessly, arms spread, waiting for Jodah to allow her to rise. Jodah waited a long moment, then said, "Arise, Magus Gerda. You said you had a crisis?" "I'm so relieved to see you well and whole," burbled the Magus. "You have no idea how worried we were when you disappeared like that. We had no idea of where you had gone. I wanted you to know, interrupted Jodah, his face stone-like and his brows furrowed, "that I have every idea of what has happened to me." "Every idea." "Surely, Lord Archmage, you don't think—" began Gerda, her eyes wide in fear. "What I think we shall discuss later," said Jodah calmly, lightning rippling beneath her words. "You said you had a crisis." "Yes, my lord. Gerda took a deep breath and let it out slowly. A semblance of calm seemed to descend on her, and when she spoke, her eyes and voice were clear and collected. "The goddess Phrylis is here, as in there in your chamber, here at the Unseen School," she said, her voice climbing as she spoke. "There's a windstorm off the coast. Half the icebreakers were overturned, and then there she was." "And what does she want?" asked Jodah. "She wants access to our archives," said Gerda, the hint of a whisper in her voice. "She wants to read the old books and tomes." Jodah was silent for a moment. Gerda added quickly, "She said you would understand and allow her this. She said I should talk to you about it, and of course I didn't know where to find you." Jodah nodded slowly. This was likely payment for her aid, and probably only partial payment at that. "Allow her to visit the vaults," he said finally. Gerda exploded in nervousness. "Archmage Eternal, we have kept that knowledge secure from the outer world for centuries." Jodah raised his voice. "Magus!" Gerda silenced as if a lid had been dropped on her. "Phrylis is not a goddess, but a planeswalker. However, she is the closest thing to a god that you'll ever see. If she wanted to, she could send her death wings through our corridors and rip the roofs from our underground vaults. She could scatter your precious volumes to the 9 winds and gather them again in an instant. She could tear open your skull with a thought and pull what she needed from there. She is being polite to ask permission. I suggest you grant it to her." Gerda was shaking now. But the ancient artifacts." "Let her access the information," said Jodah sharply, "but only the information. If she wants something, break it before you give it to her. I'm leaving you charge of this matter." Gerda looked shocked. "Me? I assumed you would return at once." Thunder seemed to dance beneath Jodah's eyebrows. "You wanted to lead the school, Gerda Ag's daughter. My disappearance has given you your chance. Until I return, you are Archmage of the Unseen. You get to deal with Phrylis and deal with her well, because if you even seem to cheat her, she will flay the flesh from your bones. And you'd best serve the interests of the school as well, because when I return, I will want a full accounting. Do you hear me? A full accounting of everything." Jodah waved for Gusta to break the connection. The Kajadorian Royal Mage moved the censer slightly aside, and Gerda dissipated in a ribbon of smoke, still fearfully sputtering and bowing. When Gusta turned back to the Archmage Eternal, Jodah was holding the bridge of his nose, his eyes closed. At length he said, "And so, Gerda Egg's daughter is due and justly punished. She is given the position she is lusted for, and she immediately finds herself over her head, trapped between her scholarly tradition and a planeswalker. Perhaps it would be more merciful to slay her." He smiled grimly. "My lord Jodah," Gusta ventured carefully, "are you all right?" Jodah gave a deep sigh. "Is this what I must always become to get things done?" he asked, more to himself than the Royal Mage. "A stern teacher, a strict parent, an angry god? Gerda thought she could replace me, But her first crisis, she comes running back to seek the hem of my robes. He shook his head. If the question is not rhetorical, said Gusta, the answer is yes. If you want to get anything done, that is. Jodah looked at the dark-haired woman and she smiled. It's all about levels of power, Gusta went on. An apprentice wants to learn enough to become a full mage. Why? So can impress his will in the world around him. And when he gets powerful enough to master one spell, he must master another for the same reason. Soldiers strive to become generals and princes become kings for the same reasons. The world is a confusing place, and they want to be able to fight the confusion. But there's never too much power, argued Jodah. A very important point, said Gusta. The world is always bigger and more confusing than you thought. And when you become king, or real mage, she shot a look at Jodah, or archmage eternal, or even a planeswalker, there's still more than you can handle. So you seek more power, said Jodah. And power corrupts. Power changes, cried Gusta, and the power of the magic is in the change. Jodah stood there for a moment, then said, but as you get more powerful, it becomes easy to order, and not listen, to command, but not obey, to teach, and never learn. He took a deep sigh. And that way lies madness. Is that why you try to start again? Asked Gusta, and for the first time it seemed an honest question. To remember how to learn? Partially, said Jodah, then shook his head. But more because the weight of all one's decisions over a single lifetime can madden, stretch it longer, and it can calcify the thoughts. So instead of bending with new experience, the mind breaks. Perhaps that's what happens to the planeswalker, said Gusta. Too much power, too much life, and too much responsibility, said Jodah. There's a long pause in the reception chamber of the Royal Mage Tower. Then Gusta broke the silence. It sounds like you weren't planning to go back anytime soon. Jodah shook his head. I fear of my own responsibilities. I have inadvertently set wheels in motion, aided the plans of others. Now I have to correct that. Things will get worse before they get better. And I'm not sure it's the right thing to get further involved. But you have to try, said Gusta. I have to try, said Jodah. Gusta looked at Jodah and shook her head, smiling. Then I will have to try as well. My cousin has spoken of you for years, Lord Archmage. From her, I always got the idea you were some type of magical ogre, demanding and controlling, and completely fearless. It's good to know you're human like the rest of us. Jodah let out a weak laugh. Human. Let's just say Jodah let out a weak laugh. Human. Let's say I've been going through some changes of late. And the power of magic is change, repeated Gusta. Somewhere in the city, a lone bell tolled the midnight. Somewhere out in the city, a lone bell tolled the midnight hour. As its muted peals drifted around them, she said, Come on. We've got an infusion of hazelnuts I can use to calm my nerves. As its muted peals drifted around them, she said, Come on. I've got an infusion of hazelnuts I use to calm my nerves. I think I can brew enough for two. At that moment, the door to the Royal Mage's quarters flew open. Its newly set protective room sprawled in protest. Yaya bolted in, hanging onto the door. Behind her in the stairway, Jodah could hear shouts and the thunder of booted feet. Gusta raised her hands to protect a spell, but Jodah stopped her. What is it? Concern painted his face. The king, panted Yaya. Garrison's cabal. They're going to kill the king. This concludes Chapter 12 of our saga. If you enjoyed the tale so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on both YouTube and your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, may your adventures be as boundless as the plains themselves. Thank you for listening.